And what I'm really trying to do here is sort of walk through what I think would be a rational way to approach a project like this, which I think you'll realize early on can get pretty complicated right off the bat. And, part of this has to do with kind of looking at screenshots of what, someone wants you to end up creating. And, you know, instead of thinking about the stuff that's, farther down, try to look at it from, a top down view of what's sort of the minimum you need to kind of get moving on this. And so my starting point on something like this would be the code that you're looking at here. I've got my home component, which is really nothing. I've got my app component, and I think I even misspoke when I first assigned this because I thought for some reason that's where we're going to end up storing the state. And I actually modified it in the workshop, but the app component really is nothing more than the hash router. And to get started, again, what I would do last with this is the search functionality. And I think if people were comfortable paging through users, I would be very happy with that. I think that's fine. I think being able to do the search functionality just will give you a little bit more insight of how you can end up leveraging the router. But I mean, as a starting point, just having 2 links and 2 routes would be totally fine. And I set up the users component as a class component because this is where I'm going to be pulling data from. So hopefully, again, my thing here is that when you're getting started, you don't want to have to type in a bunch of code to get started. And, this would be maybe your first iteration of this. Now, as we start to build it out, I think the second thing that I had sort of mentioned is I want you to start seeing some users. So the idea here is the work that you're going to do really is going to happen in this users component. And we always, since our state is going to end up changing, there are only 2 things that we need to track on the state. And this is where I think there is legitimately some confusion, where folks start to think that one of the things they need to put on the state is the current page that they're on. And that's something that you don't need. You're going to get that information because you're going to put that on the route itself. So for this to work, we always want to set default values. And I don't know, I ended up using async await on this. But we are, when the component mounts, I'm making a call. And again, I'm not even worrying about any parameters here. I'm just making a call. I'm getting the data back. This gives me the count and gives me the users. And it's, bare minimum. The thing that I want to just sort of really drive home is that ideally you have some data that you could end up working with. And the first thing that you want to end up doing is being able to see that you could end up seeing that data. So when our component ends up mounting, our state is going to end up changing, hopefully, if this request is successful. I'll have my count and I'll have my users, and I'm just going to display it, right? So this should render 50 users, and I'm just doing it at this point just in an unordered list. So again, not thinking, through, hey, look, what, I need to have every table element that's there. Again, just seeing that you can end up getting some data. And if anyone's got any questions so far, let me know if there's any of this code that doesn't seem to make any sense. Let me know. I'll be happy to talk about it. Okay. So now we've got some users that are showing up. And the next thing that I'm going to do, and again, I'm not even going to think about this all that deeply here, but the next thing that I'm going to do is start generating links for all of my pages of data. So how do I end up getting that? Well, I've got a count, And what I could end up, and this is something that I know I would know if I ended up looking at the API, or this could be information that the API ends up returning to me. But I can calculate the total number of pages, right? So if we end up, again, take the example of having, 50 items per page and you have 102 items back, you're going to have a total of 3 pages. And all I'm doing here to make my life a little bit easier for me is I'm generating a collection of links that's going to allow me to loop over. Because one of the things that I can do in React is I can end up mapping. But I need to map over something, right? In my JSX, I can't just start writing out statements. That's not something that I could end up doing. But very easily, I could end up doing map, which gives me a bunch of other React elements. So the idea here is that I'm basically just looping, and this is where nothing is wrong with using a regular for loop. And I've got a collection of links. Each link has an index, so the first one's going to be at 0. But again, even though the index is 0, because that's the way the API looks, on the page, I want that to be page 1. So I have a text and I have an index. And if I move down here, the only other change that's here is to use my link, and this is dynamically going to be for each of these links. Again, this is not the end solution because there's going to be a lot of links that are there. There's, I don't know, something around 160 pages of data. There's a lot of records that are in those tables. So here, I end up generating these links. Okay. Again, just a little bit at a time to get through here. I haven't dealt with any updating or anything along those lines. And right now, I'm hard-coded only to get my first page of data. But at least I've got my links that are showing up. Everything else really is the same. And this is a minor change, but one of the things that I added here in the next iteration is to actually change the route here. So what this allows me to do is to specify, hey, look, this route has an optional parameter. So if you end up coming to this route with /users, that's fine. That's still valid, and I'm just going to give you the first page of users. But if you come in with a value, a number, you'll also end up hitting this route. If I didn't end up putting this in, this would only work for the main route. And the other thing that I'm doing here is that once I end up doing that, I'm actually doing a little work here. So this is the reason why you don't have to store the current page in the state. You have it, right? The current page is on the router. It's on a route parameter. And if you don't have it, it means you have a 0. And if you have the match params, and again, the way that this component is structured, this user's component is right here. So it ends up getting past the match parameters for this route. Because again, the router says, hey, look, React Router says, hey, look, I see that there is a parameterized component here. I assume you might want to do something with it. And so what we end up doing here is we look and see if we could find that value. So we don't need to put that value on the state. We end up getting it from the router. And I think that that's something that confuses even, I think, seasoned developers that, they look at something and they say, well, it's something that's changing, but it has to be on the state. But the fact is that React Router has its own state, and it's keeping track of the parameters. Anytime that the URL ends up changing, this is going to end up getting called again. And so let the router be the source of truth, right? We don't have to go in and start setting these values in the state. We're going to get them right from the router. And what this allows us to do, and it's not really all that great a look here, is just to go over here and say, hey, look, if the IDX that we have for this page is the same as the IDX for the link, we're just not going to show an underline, right? Not the most amazing thing, but it would allow us to basically highlight the page that the user ended up clicking on. And so again, the idea here is to just build this stuff out a little bit at a time. And then we eventually get to the critical part of this. And this is, well, this is fine for a hard reload, but we really want to use these parameters. So we change it a little bit. And if our component ends up mounting, we're going to look at the parameters. And what we'll end up doing here is that if there's no index, we're going to use 0 here. We make an Axios call, and this can end up being passed with 0. That will work out fine. But we end up making an Axios call, and we end up getting our data back. Okay? Now, what we also want to do is that if the user ends up clicking on a link, we also want that to reflect the new data. And we don't want to get ourselves in the position of having an infinite loop. So we know that, because one of the things that will happen here is that when we end up updating the state, the component will end up updating. And really what we want to do here is we want to ask the question, hey, look, we only need to go and get new data if, in fact, the page that you're on ended up changing. And we end up finding it from the match params because the component will update every time the user ends up clicking on a new link. And again, the way to think about that is that React Router has its own state. And React Router says, hey, look, as far as I'm concerned, when a parameter ends up changing on a route, that's an update. And I'm going to let you know about the update. And the only reason we have to put this condition in is that we're going to end up changing the state. And we don't want to have ourselves in an infinite loop on this state. Because if you did and everybody ended up doing it, it would end up taking down my server, which wouldn't be a great thing. I think there's actually a little bit of code I need to put in my server to kind of make sure that that doesn't happen. But this is, again, you know, whenever you're updating and you're changing the state, you better have some condition that keeps you from going in to one of these infinite loops. And this is, again, a very common situation that you run into, and you'll know it because you'll see that you're constantly making requests, and you go like, well, why does it keep on making requests? Make a request to the same page. Well, just say, hey, look, I only want to do this if the index ends up changing. If the previous props index is different, then I want to go and get my data. That's a big sort of turning point in this application. And a lot of the other things that you'll see on top of this really are a little bit of, you know, French pastry in terms of the UI for this. Any questions about this code? So one thing that you just have to be aware of is that when you use this lifecycle method, and you'll often use it when you'll use it to update the state, just be careful of the infinite loop. And I think everything else in here was relatively the same. So, you know, look, at that point, you have the application working. You can, you know, make the pager a little bit nicer. I mean, right now, the pager is showing everything. And this is just one way to do this. So this might look a little cheesy here, and it probably is, and there could be better ways to do it. But here I'm just asking the question. I'm saying, hey, look, if the index for this is 0, meaning it's the first page, or the index is the last page, if those two scenarios are true, or if the index that I'm on is either the if the index I'm looping over is the index of my page, or it's one greater than or one less than. And that's what the math.absolute ends up doing. And by the way, there are other ways to do this as well. This to me just seemed like a quick, maybe even a little bit of a dirty way to do this, because what'll happen is that if you end up returning an undefined value from the map, React basically just ignores it. React doesn't care about it. Doesn't care about undefined, doesn't care about null, doesn't end up doing anything with it. So at most, I'm going to end up getting 5 links on this page, depending upon where I am. Not necessarily perfect, but first page, last page, and possibly the page that you're on, and the page before, and the page after. So look, if people got something up to this point, I'm very happy with it. I think that that's great. The search box could have been a little bit of a stretch, but the the mechanism for dealing with the search box, has to do with sort of leveraging what we could end up doing with our router. So in terms of adding the search box, there's really a couple of different things that I end up doing here. First of all, now we've got the idea of the state changing in our application. Someone's going to start typing in the text box, and also someone's going to want to search with what they end up putting in the text box. So all that I'm going to end up doing here, and let me also just point out one other thing here. I also ended up sort of drawing out my code a little bit by moving it into a fetch data and saying, hey, look, when the component mounts, I'm going to end up calling fetch data. And here I did something a little bit different here, because now I've got different parameters that I could end up putting in the search. So I'm just stringifying these objects to see, hey, look, did something end up changing on the URL? If it does, I'm going to end up fetching the data. And really the big sort of difference here, here's my text box. I put my on change in. I've got my on search here. This actually is incorrect, but I don't think it ends up breaking anything because it'll just end up using this. That shouldn't be in there. But the big difference here is that I've got another route. And the other route says, hey, look, if you end up going to this page with search, and you better give me a search term, and also you can give me an optional index here. And that just allows me to basically have another URL which will determine what the user ends up looking at. And if I scroll up here, I'll see that I'm just doing a little bit more work here. So when I go to fetch my data, I'm looking at the search, which I'm getting from the params. I'm looking at the index, and I'm generating my URL. The important thing to see here is that when I go to search, really all I'm doing is changing the URL, right? I'm basically saying, because once I do a new search, I don't know what page I'm going to wind up on because I don't know how much data that I have. So someone ends up clicking on that button where they want to search on a page. What I want to do is I just want to use my history object, which again is dynamically letting me change the route. So where do we get that history object from? Well, if you're inside of a route, you're going to end up automatically getting past the history object. And again, I don't have a button there. I mean, I have a button there, but those aren't links. So nothing prevents me from doing this. Again, what I'm sort of getting at here is that when the user ends up making a change to say that they want to search, I change the URL. Everything is dependent upon the URL. That's a good thing, because that means that if I did a search and I'm on the 8th page of data and everything is dependent upon the URL, I could take that URL and I could send it to you and you would see the exact same thing that I'm seeing. And that really sort of leverages what you're able to do with React Router. And the rest of it is just really maybe polishing it up a little bit, separating out some of the components. Here I ended up separating out the users, maybe having some utility methods that'll let, say, hey, look, given an IDX and given a search term, tell me what the URL is supposed to do. And I could use that both here when I am fetching my data. But the nice thing about that is I could also use that when I'm generating my links. Because again, if a user's searching on data and there's 7 pages of records that have the name John in them, again, I want them to still be searching on John for the 2nd and 3rd page of records as well. Again, if the search is kind of getting past you, it's totally fine. If it's not, and you like this, that's great. But my main thing is that you have the ability to end up paging through data. There's a lot of things that can end up going wrong in an application like this. And that's why I think sort of separating out things as much as possible is going to become pretty important. But at least we know one thing is that at the end of the day, everything is going to be dependent upon our routes, which is something that's, again, makes things a lot easier when we decide to share a page with somebody else, which I think is pretty critical in an application. So that was about the extent of what I wanted to really talk about with that solution. How many people were able to, let me actually stop sharing my screen so I could see you guys a little better. So how many of you were able to page through data? Give me a thumbs up. Anybody get to the search? Catherine, put your thumb up higher. It's a good thing. Yeah, there you go. Not too high. I can't see that. All right. It's good. It's not a simplistic solution. And the fact is that, look, you're still working at this. Your solution might work, but it could also end up being, the code maybe could be dried out a lot. Maybe things could be separated out a little bit better. Again, this is all part of the learning process. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, since you have all of this code, and I believe you probably just have it on your computer, I was wondering if you could humor me momentarily and actually show that page live and do just from wherever you are in just /users, whether it has an index or not that you're indexing to. Can you make a search and show the network part in Google Chrome?
Yeah. So I was going to tell you, no, I don't have it working, but hopefully I do. That would be embarrassing, right? It was a, see, hold on, let me share my screen. I might have to borrow Jonathan's code, which he'd be very happy with. But I actually have it here. All right. So again, mine is not the prettiest code here. Let me refresh this page. Okay. So let's start off with the home page. Nothing all that interesting here. We've got users. And so here's my first page. Here's my last page. And again, this is not the perfect pager, but will satisfy the condition. So I think let's take a look at our network requests. Okay. Okay, let me clear this out. Let me refresh. Okay. So by default, what it ends up doing is that it gets the first page of records, right? And every time that I end up going through here, so if I end up clicking on page 2, I'll see it's going to be, this is in the second page of records. And every time I go through here, I should see the name start, increasing towards the end of the alphabet. A lot of A's here. Eventually, I'll get to some B's. So again, those are all those requests, right? And if I do a hard reload, right, I'll see it only ends up getting this page. Let me move this down a little bit. And you'll see that, again, it's getting it from this value. Now, when I end up doing a search, so I'm going to go over here, and I'll say, let's do JO. And I click on search. So what it's doing there is that this is what I had before, but now it's calling a different path, right? Now it's calling user search, and it's saying the search term is going to be Joe, and it wants the first page of data. And there's a few pages of data here, right? There's actually a total of 9 pages of data. So if I ended up going to the 9th page, right, it's going to do that same thing, but again, this is 0-based. So this is the 8th page of data that it ends up getting. And again, if I do a hard reload here, I'll see that's the only request that it ends up making. Again, this could definitely be cleaned up a little bit, but again, it satisfies what we're trying to accomplish here. Make sense?
Makes sense to me. I had an issue with double fetch requests.
Yeah, and I didn't.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's fine. And I know, that does happen. And look, usually, it's going to be some result of, again, the pattern that I'm using here is purely a URL-based pattern, right? I mean, there's only 2 ways that I move around in this application. Either I've got a hard reload, I go to the page for the first time, right? And then the fetch is based upon, what my URL looks like. Or I end up clicking on a link, which ends up changing the URL. And again, I'm preventing it from happening, more than once by putting some flag in the component did update. Or the other way, when someone clicks on the search box, puts a value in the search box, and in that one, it might as well be the same thing as changing a link, because I'm using the history object to change the link. So it does happen, sometimes, but it could just be like the order that things are happening, and maybe there's a history change that's happening twice that you might not be aware of, or something along those lines. It's not uncommon. And it's one of those things where, look, with this pattern, I should be able to track it pretty easily, because the fact is there's only one spot in the app where I'm making that Axios call. So I should be able to see where that's coming from. But this is also one of those things where, like, if you didn't use this pattern and things were working, you're like, man, it's making a second request. It's one of those things where maybe you put it on the back burner a little bit and you go, I got to go figure out why it's doing there. I mean, if you're anything like me, you're the type of person that would drive you crazy until you go in there and figure it out.
It did drive me crazy.
Yeah. I think having the one spot where the Axios calls get made is really helpful, because there's only one way in, and you could sort of determine how did it get in here a different way. But again, if people were able to get the paging done, I think that's great. What I really just wanted to focus on is the idea that you could have, build out a pretty interesting application, by just having access to some data. Now, again, you might look at this and say, this is not really all that interesting, but imagine if you had all kinds of, facets that these users have, and, you could, have a bunch of filters that are on the top of the page, being able to sort all those things. That could make for a pretty interesting application without really having to. It's always nice when you can rely on somebody else's data to make your life a lot easier. And one of the things we'll find out is that there are a plethora of APIs out there that you could end up using in your applications to really do some, interesting things. So, any other questions that anyone has? I could say that in some ways this could be a little bit of a stretch to do, but hopefully you guys definitely got something out of it. I hope.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How would you do? I think on like your demo one in the YouTube video, like when you search where it highlights.
Oh yeah, that's tough. Yeah, and I had that in initially, so that's an interesting problem to solve. And really, what it ends up coming down to, there's a number of ways to do it. But if you think about it, you have the search term, right? Because you have it right over here, right? In this case, it would be Joe. So what you could end up doing, I think I did it in a really kind of a cheesy way, is that whenever I ended up outputting something, I think basically all I ended up doing was splitting up the data. And there might be a better way to do this, but I ended up splitting up the data. And if it matched that search term, I surrounded it with a span and gave it a CSS class. And it's not the prettiest solution, but it seemed to work. And I could send you that. But that's, there might be a better way to do that. I'm sure somebody, not that you have to use it, but, there might even be a React plugin that has that functionality that you could end up using it. And they're doing something along those lines. I mean, what are they really doing? They're modifying the HTML, right? Because that's going to be some kind of class that they're putting on. They're dynamically sort of shoving spans within this table cell. But that's kind of a fun thing to do because that could be really, useful as well. Any other questions that anybody has? No? All right. So what I would like to do is, and maybe one of the things you could do, Nick, I think you had sent something out. I don't know if you got any feedback in terms of, what stuff people wanted to take a look at today. I saw something in one of the Slack channels, maybe last night or something like that. Maybe.
I personally just posted a question that I had, but I think Jonathan or Gabriel kind of answered it fairly clearly.
Okay.
I felt like I had one more question, but it's eluding me right now.
Well, what I want to do is I'm going to go over the React self checkpoint. I'm going to pull it down. Let's go through it. Let's talk about what these React tests look like. And then while I'm doing this, if you have a piece of paper and you want to jot down some questions, let's go into it. We could do maybe a little bit more with Webpack today. If I'm doing a demo, I don't really have any problem doing that. And talk about some of the, the main concepts that we've ended up looking at really up to this point. So what I'm going to do here is let me stop sharing for a quick sec. Talk among yourselves. Okay. No one wants to talk. All right. What I'm going to do.
Myself, not to you.
They don't want to talk to me? Preston, I tell you, if I ever come out there, you're in trouble. All right. So what I want to do here, let me just back up here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to do a git.clone. And this is the checkpoint for React. I did it a couple of times already, but I'm just going to rename it. And you guys, when you do it through LearnDot, it does a fork instead of a clone. Okay. So I'm going to do an npm install. A lot of this node stuff will start making a bit more sense when we start getting into this. I think we get into it next week. So this is going to install. And so, front end, look, we've got to do some sorts of assessment, right? And one of the ways at Full Stack we do assessments is through giving you tests and getting you to get those tests to pass. And again, it's just one way of doing assessment. But one of the things that I think sometimes trips people up a little bit is that it's not easy to look at someone else's specs. The specs are very often a lot more complicated than the code is. And some of this stuff is going to look very new because we're actually there are specific libraries that we have to use in React to actually do the testing. So I'm going to go over here, move a couple of things out of the way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type in npm test. All right, and here's a bunch of code that's here. I'm going to start getting these to pass. And the way that this stuff will often work, and this would work the same way if you were doing test-driven development. The only difference with test-driven development is that you would be writing the tests as opposed to somebody else supplying the tests for you. So let's go over here, and we've got our tests. These are the specs that are running. And again, a lot of this stuff is not all that important, but there is a library that is actually built by Airbnb, believe it or not, a library specifically for React testing. And this library is Enzyme. It's an open source library. A lot of companies end up starting with projects that are in-house, and they end up doing them open source, and they end up picking up a fair amount of momentum. And this is something that has happened with Enzyme. And what you'll often end up seeing, the way that these tests are written, is that it's going to look like JSX. And what you could really think about this as doing is that when we end up using the shallow method from Enzyme, what it allows us to do is not only to have that component end up rendering, but it allows us to investigate that component to see if it has the things that we want it to have. So if I scroll down here, it's telling me that it has a pet to adopt on its state. First of all, it's telling me that it must be a stateful component, because if it was a stateful component, I wouldn't be able to get the state from it. And if I go and I look at this, I'll see that this will end up failing. And this is just a question of moving back and forth between two different files. So again, this is the way that any of these test assessments will end up working. One of the things that you want to do is see what the test is trying to do. You don't have to understand every single line of the test, but I saw a couple of things here. I saw it was using adoption agency, and unless someone was attempting to, well, I mean, one of the things I could also do is find out when I look at adoption agency, I could go up here and see where adoption agency is coming from, and that would lead me to this file that's over here. So this I could tell is a class component. I could also tell it looks like it's bringing in another component here, which is an indication that maybe it's going to ask me to use it at some point in the future. But it's basically telling me that on the state, there's going to be a pet to adopt. Don't worry, the pet's name is not Mocha. All right? And it's telling me that not only is it going to be there, but it wants it to be an object as well. And then this test will end up passing. And in fact, I probably went a little bit of ahead here because Here I'm going to see that it just exists, and here it wants to see that it's an object. An object meaning that it's an object. It's not a string, it's not a number, it's an object. And that'll end up passing as well. And if we move down a little bit farther, it's saying, hey, look, this component itself has a method. And the method is going to be a function. And the name of this method is going to be adoptPet. And it's actually checking for a couple of things at the same time. This is not, people will talk to you about test-driven development. Some people might even say, you really should only have one expectation in either of these things. And one thing you could always do as you're going through this is you could always get a little bit to pass at a time. Now, again, this is still going to fail. Passing. adoptPet, maybe they gave it to us already. No. A little bit weird. You know, that's a very interesting thing. What this tells me, this is a little screwy here. Something maybe to look into. Let's go over here. Now I'm actually calling it. And this actually blows up because it doesn't exist. That's interesting. I wonder why this ends up passing. There's got to be something off with this line of code. I'm not going to worry about it right now. But here, let me go over here. And it's telling me there's supposed to be a function on here called adoptPet. Now I put that function on it. That ends up passing. Right? So it's, again, it's not uncommon. You saw it in the thing that I just did, right? I put other methods on my users component, right? I put a search method on that users component. Very often we put on change methods when we're changing the state on our components. And usually, not always, but usually if there's a method there, the only reason you would call a method is to end up changing the state. So usually it's going to end up changing the state. And here it's saying, hey, look, I expect if I gave you a pet, this pet I gave you is going to be the pet that's on your state. This is going to fail. And all I need to do here is go over here, and it's this dot set state. And on our state, we have a pet to adopt. And this is going to be our pet that we're going to end up adopting. And that should end up getting that to pass. Let me know if anyone has any questions. Now, this is actually testing something else. It's asking you, hey, look, this should be bound to the context of the component. Meaning that it should have a bind method there. Now, even though the test is passing, it's testing it out a little bit of a different way here. And this ends up failing. And the reason why it's failing, and this is also pretty common, is that within our constructor, we're going to say this adoptPet equals this adoptPet. We want to make sure that even as a naked function, it's bound correctly. That ends up passing as well. So they're actually starting off with stuff that's a little bit more complex than I would necessarily start off with. This is the stuff that I think is a little bit easier to deal with. So here, we're going to check, hey, look, when we end up changing the state, what I expect to find out is that, hey, look, when you end up changing the state here, and I go and I look for this H3, I should find this string. You are adopting Cody. I'm going to cheat a little bit. So here's my they actually gave it to me, so I didn't even have to cheat that much. So what I'm going to do here is I'll go over here, and I'm going to say, I like to do this. Pet to adopt. I'm getting this from this dot state. And here I'm going to put in pet to adopt dot name. And let me just see if I ended up uncommenting that as a test. And that ends up passing. So now it's going to ask about these two components. So we've got this pet preview component, and what it's going to ask us about, it's going to say, hey, look, one of the things that Enzyme can do is that it can look for pet previews, right? So pet preview, if I didn't know where it was, I could see that it's being brought in here. And if I scroll down here, I'm going to go over here, and this is going to end up failing. It says one for dogs and one for cats, saying I didn't find any. And I could go over here, and I could get this to pass. They were nice enough to actually bring this in before. And I could go down here, and under dogs, put in pet preview. Do the same thing under cats. And it ends up passing the test. Now, if I go back here, it's being a little bit more specific. It says, not only do I want to find the pet preview, but I'm going to look for the one that's underneath dogs. So again, Enzyme is pretty powerful, right? Enzyme can actually move through this tree because what do you have really? You have this tree of components. It's going to start off with adoption agency. It's going to find where the pound dogs is. It's going to look in that, look for the pet preview, and see, hey, look, did you pass these dogs as pets for dogs? And did you pass the ones as cats for cats? Both these end up failing. And if I go back over here, again, I like to do this. Cats, dogs, right? That's how I named them on the state. And I'm going to go down here and say pets equals dogs. Pets equals cats. And those tests end up passing as well. So any questions about this so far? This idea of someone giving you tests and get them to pass, you know, you're going to be adding methods, you're going to be binding the methods. Just follow along with what the spec is asking you to do. So here, now it's telling us something else. This is kind of an interesting thing because we've done this before. It might not feel like it from looking at test-driven development, but just think about it for a second. You know, we've done things where we have on the top level of our component, we have things like users or things or something along those lines, and we pass methods down so that the state of our component could end up being manipulated. We'll pass something down like create user. We'll pass something down called delete user. And the reason why we do it is that our state is higher up, and we want components that are farther down to impact the state. So the way that we do it is we end up passing methods down. And here it's saying, we're going to look, and we want you to pass down adopt pet. So you have an instance of adopt pet. We want you to pass it down. And what that's an indication of is that these other components are going to have the ability to modify our state. And just, you know, not to be a spoiler, but people are going to be able to see a little dog ear cat. That's what we're going for. So here, we're passing And again, I like to do this, right? I like less dots. Adopt pet, I'm going to get from this, and it's just asking me to pass it, okay? Again, what I'm doing here is I'm passing an entree to change the state of my component to other components. It seems reasonable because that's the way things are going to end up changing within this application. Again, if I have my state higher up, which I do in this case. So adopt pet, adopt pet. And now we've got some more tests that are passing. And let's go down here. And I think what we'll probably do next is now we're going to look at this pet preview. Sorry, cat lovers. We're just going to be working with dogs for a moment. And we've got a lot of cat lovers in the class. I saw The Secret Life of Pets last night. There was a lot of cats in Secret Life of Pets Part 2. Quite good. All right, so here we're going to look at this pet preview. And we're going to look at the state, and we're expecting pet to preview to exist, and this is also going to be an empty object. So now we're going to focus on pet preview. This ends up failing. Let's go back over here. And now for all intents and purposes, I don't really even need this component anymore. So I'm going to go and look at pet preview. And it's asking for pet to preview. By the way, if I was going to name this property in my state, I would probably just name it pet. I didn't write the spec. It's asking it to be an empty object. And that ends up passing. Now, it's also going to ask me, it's got a method called preview pet. And it ends up taking an event. And the event has a target value, which is a pet matching the name on the state. So let's just take a look at this. So here it's testing this out with an event. Here's a pet. And it's saying, hey, look, once in fact, we have preview pet. This is a function. When we end up calling it, we end up changing the state. So we've got a couple of things that are being passed in here. We know we've got pets. Here we get a value, which is going to end up being a name. So here, this method, let's actually put this in. Preview pet is not a function, so let's put it in. Let's make preview pet a function, right? It's really saying to me, hey, look, I'm giving you some pets. I'm passing in. This is actually an interesting thing. And we could look at this and say, well, where the heck did these pets come from? But one of the things that you sort of saw from the other spec, and you have to think back a little bit, is that there are actually props that are being passed here. We could actually see it. It's being passed pets, which are dogs. So when this ends up coming in here, we're going to get this event. We're going to look at its target.value. And what we're going to end up doing here, we're just going to go and find our pet. We're going to say pet equals this dot props dot pets, because that's what got passed in here, and we just want to find. Which one do we want? Well, when we look over these pets, we want the name of the pet, to equal, and it told us that we get the name from the target value. And it's saying when this ends up happening, what we want to have happen is that we want to end up setting our state. The only thing on our state to set is pet to preview, and we're going to set it to this pet that we just ended up finding. Event is not defined because I called it EV over here, and now this ends up passing. So it also has another method. It has another method called adopt selected pet. And what it's testing here is that when we end up when we have adopted selected pet, we're going to end up calling it. And we've got something up here, the adopt pet spy, which is somewhere over here. This is being passed in here. And so we passed in our function, and we want to make sure that that function ends up getting called. So I'm going to go over here. So we're looking for a method called adopt selected pet. Doesn't exist. Adopt selected pet is a method. And when I end up calling it, what it wants to see happen is that it wants to see that our spy that's up here, I got to keep on going back and forth on this because the naming is definitely throwing me off. This is going to be this dot props adopt pet, and it wants to make sure this ends up getting called from the value that we have in our state. You guys like jigsaw puzzles, by the way? Just feel a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. I don't like jigsaw puzzles, so it's not my favorite thing here. Look, this is one of those things. After you end up putting it together, you'll sort of see what all the parts are here. Here, it's actually just saying, hey, look, we want both these methods to actually bind correctly, and this is pretty common stuff. So we go over here. One, two. And here it's just telling us or asking us to bind this properly. This is always where these things get bound. This dot adopt selected pet equals this dot adopt selected pet bind to this. So it'll end up working when we want it to work. This dot preview pet dot bind this, and we'll get both of those to end up passing. So let's take a look. It's also saying you're going to have an adoption form on this page. So right now this will end up failing, but if we go over here, and they were actually very nice to us, they've actually told us where the adoption form is. So we're going to take this adoption form. Doesn't say where it has to be. And we're just going to end up using it. And now that passes. And it's going to probably ask us a couple of questions. So the thing that you're seeing here is that you've got state on the top level of the application, and the state is being passed down. And it's going to ask some questions. It's also going to say, hey, look, do you want to, if we end up setting the state pet to preview, it should end up using the image URL for that pet. So I'm going to go over here. And I like to do this. From the state. And here we're going to say I don't know if they did this all uppercase. They might not have. No. Expected undefined. Let's just see. Pet to preview is Taylor. Let's make sure I have this right. Let's see what the dogs look like. It's image URL. That looks right. No, IMG, they're calling it. Oh, whew. That ends up passing. Let's look for our next exit. So here, what it's saying is that we've got this other component, and we're passing whatever props got passed in, we want this to end up getting passed down. And it's also saying, we also want you to pass down this preview pet method that you have. So it's checking that you're passing these props. And in fact, we could do all three of these. Let's just see if they're named the same thing. Adopt selected pet. So we've got pets, preview pet, adopt selected pet, all these things that we have in these methods are going to be passed down here. So we're going to get pets is coming in from this dot props, right? We have state at the top. They're getting passed down as props. Pets equals pets. Pet. Preview pet gets passed down. And what was the last one? The last one was adopt selected pet. Preview pet is not defined because I'm getting it from both preview pet and adopt selected pet are coming from this. Now that ends up passing. Let's hope that this is going to be over soon. Forgot it was this long. We need to go and take a look at our adoption form. So our adoption form needs to have a button and a select object and options. We're going to do this in one shot. Okay. We get a lot of this to pass. Okay. So we're going to have a bunch of stuff passing. So we're going to look for a button, a select, and options. And this is going to be coming from our adoption form. So here we've got our props that are coming in. And so one of the things that we could get from our props is our pets. And what we're going to end up doing here is we're going to put in a select. We're going to put in a button. We're going to end up putting in some options here that we're getting from pets. So we'll say pets, we want to map over you. We've got a pet. This is going to be an option. We want to show the name of our pet.
You want to do pet.name, I believe, not option.
Thank you. Thank you. Pets of undefined.
I think you have pets equal to pets instead of props.
Right. Thank you. So expected null to equal Taylor, and I think it's asking for the key to be the name. So that will end up passing these. And the last thing that it's doing is it's saying, hey, look, when a user ends up changing the on change, we want to call preview pet. So we've got these two things coming in, adopt selected pet and preview pet. Let's start off with preview pet. So we're going to do on change to do something. And here I'm going to bring in preview pet. Actually, I'll do it right up here. On change, I want to call that function that got passed in here. And this will automatically, for a select object, it'll end up getting, that's why it was set up. It looked a little bit weird, but the event arguments with the name get passed up. And the last thing that it wants us to do is that it wants us to also call adopt selected pet. Okay. And let's make sure that this passes. All right, now for the fun stuff. Let's see if we could open this up. Might be using, let's see. It's using Webpack Dev Server, so we're going to do npm run build. I'm going to take this. Now for the great stuff, right? We go over here. We pick Reggie. We say we're going to adopt Reggie. And Reggie shows up here. Fellini. We could end up adopting Fellini. We could switch this up. You guys notice any sort of issues with this page? What's the one thing that would sort of be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if we refreshed the page? We saw what we had selected. It's not going to work unless you end up using the router. This is definitely, I must admit, this is fairly over-engineered for what we're trying to accomplish here. Probably the best thing you could end up doing, I mean, you sort of have to start somewhere. I mean, we could start by looking at the form itself. I mean, all you really know about this is that, hey, when this thing changes, we're calling one method. When this thing ends up changing, we're going to call a different method. And, you know, we could end up either moving up or moving down. If we look at the pet preview, right, this is what's passing in the information to the adoption form. Here, this is probably one too many components to have this functionality. But I think the idea here was to just show you that you have the ability to basically have state on these components. So we've got this pet preview that has a state, and that state is being set when someone ends up selecting a pet that they want to preview, but we've got the state that's farther up, which has not only our cats and our dogs, but you could imagine this would end up coming from an Axios request or something along those lines, but also has a state for the actual pet that we're going to end up adopting. Everyone got all that? Again, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the easiest thing to do. This is really one where you just have to follow what the specs are asking you to do. I think it's probably a decent practice to do for Tuesday. Anyway, let me check and see.